Okay, welcome everyone to our second MORE event, Maynooth Open Research. I'm delighted to welcome Professor John Towse, and it looks like we have an international audience, which is brilliant to see. I don't just mean people from the Republic of Cork, but people from outside of the island as well. So it's great to see so many people coming along. I know everyone is crazy busy at the moment. So it's great to have John joining us. John is a former colleague from Lancaster University. Don't hold that against him, but he's also being a supporter of open science and open research more generally for a long time, helping get the Prosper Promoting Open Science practices group set up at Lancaster, creating an open access journal for numerical cognition, as well as a whole pile of other service work that he's done to help put open research on the agenda. So without further ado, it's great that we're going to hear about when is data sharing, not data sharing, an open science riddle. So take it away when you're ready, John.
Thanks very much, Dermot. It's great to be able to talk to people. So, as you just indicated, I've got a screen view of the slides here. I don't have any vision of the chat or you. I'm happy to take questions as we go through if somebody wants to just shout out, because that you know, if I hear somebody talking, then I know that there's something coming in, but I won't be able to see otherwise. Okay, so what I want to do in this talk is to begin by just saying a little bit about the idea of sharing research data as part of the research process, and give you a little bit of context for that.
Irish celebrities.
That's very rapidly going to move into a description of what we usually think of as the problem around data sharing. And some evidence that what we normally think of as the data sharing problem is a bit of a problem, but isn't necessarily really the core of the problems that we're actually experiencing in science. And then I want to present some data from psychology that I've been involved in that looks at the profile and pattern of data sharing. But one of the points that I want to make is, whilst I'm looking at this from a psychological lens, because I'm a psychologist, I really want to argue that this is a general problem, general to science, general possibly to tertiary education. So I'm going to make some remarks about what's happening outside of psychology as well as inside, to see whether, as I say, we're really looking at a general issue. And I hope that will lead us to think about action recommendations that might help the situation. And part of those recommendations or action, I want to talk a little bit about training, raising the capacity of future generations to overcome what I'm going to describe as some of the problems. And hopefully that will lead to some conclusions and some discussion. So let's get cracking. So I think probably most people connected to this call have some familiarity with the notion of open science, open research, or open scholarship. And as part of that mission, the mantra is that we should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So open with respect to our research aims, as well as our research findings, the assets that we have in doing the research that we're involved in. And I want to just make the point that this isn't really such a new idea. And to do so, I want to give you a quote from Francis Galton in 1901. And of course, Francis Galton is also known for some vile views on racism and eugenics, and quoting him has nothing to do with endorsing those views, but merely the historical context, and also somebody who was clearly at the forefront of science at the time. So what he said in 1901 as editor of a major journal is that he'd begun to think that no one ought to publish biometric results without lodging a well-arranged and well-bound manuscript copy of all his data in some place where it should be accessible under reasonable restrictions to those who desire to verify his work. And it's Perniger who reminded us of this quote from Galton. So, well over 100 years ago, people were thinking that some form of data sharing is a good idea. And I want to just take this one stage further in terms of thinking about why. And one of them is because it's important to be able to look at the record, the research record that that people are engaged in. And in fact, we can look at Francis Galton's own work in this respect. One of the things that he's known for is the modern phenomena of the wisdom of crowds. He published a short piece in Nature in 1907 when he was almost 85, arguing that the broad view, the vox populi, was a very good way of understanding real world phenomena. So he was at a country fair, and people were paying to estimate the weight of a cow, and there was a prize for the person who got the closest estimate. Now, what he wrote about this in a rather hurried publication in Nature was that the middlemost estimate of the cow from the hundreds of estimates that had been made was 1,207 pounds, and that the weight of the ox was 1,198 pounds, and that was only 9 pounds too high. So if you take everybody's judgment and you find the median, Galton was particularly keen on the use of the median, that this was a really good and accurate estimate, even though individual estimates from farmers, from butchers, from people who you'd think would be experts on this was really very good. And indeed, he wrote to his nephew separately to say the average was 11 pounds wrong. So the mean was not so good as an account. Now, we have his records. As you can see here, there's an extract from Galton's worksheets. And a couple of things. It turns out that actually the median is 1,208, not 1,207 pounds, and the actual weight written in notes on the left of the worksheet was 1,197. He's transposed these numbers. You know, these things happen. So actually, the median is 11 pounds out, not 9. He's kind of undersold very, very slightly and insignificantly the differential. But actually, the mean weight rather than the median is 1,197, which is the exact weight. So actually, the median was even more accurate than the median that he'd proposed. Now, all of this is to say it's because we've got his worksheets, because we've got records of his letters to his nephew, the letters from the fair confirming what the actual weight was and so on, that we can explore these issues and you know, correct science or clarify things. I'm not making any claim that there's a huge error in here. The basic substance of his argument has stood the test of time, but it's the data sharing that's allowed us to follow this up. And then finally, just to say that, of course, now in 2022, we really have the digital tools to make data sharing possible, feasible, and to make these research assets open. We've got the internet. We've got DOIs, digital object identifiers, and hyperlinks. We've got repositories with long-term retention plans. All these things are now possible in a way that wouldn't have been so at the start of the 1900s. So, sorry, one other thing to say about data sharing is that you might think people would do it if only for selfish reasons, because there's increasing evidence that data sharing can help researchers gain more impact, that is, citations from the work. So in different scenarios, there's evidence that papers that have data sharing, where papers link to data, there's an increase in the citation impact of that work. So not only does it allow other people to look at your work and follow it up, it maybe helps your own work as well. So just one thing to point out here about data sharing and the advocacy of it is I've already pointed to some of the different reasons why we might want to promote data sharing. Some of them are about transparency, about reproducibility. If I look at somebody else's data set, can I get to the point where I can find the same results that are quoted in the paper. If I run my analysis through my software compared to the authors, will I find the same thing? Or can I aggregate data? But there are other things that we might want to do. We might want to reconceptualize the data. We might want to rescale some of the original data so that we can see whether if you take one item out or you treat an item differently, it will affect the quality, the psychometric quality of the measures we've got. Of course, in the future, statisticians might come up with wonderful, fancy, gee whiz ways of analysing data that I just don't know of at the time. If I share my data, those fancy gee whiz statistics can be applied to my data to find things out that, as I said, wouldn't be possible at the minute. And then also, as I've highlighted here, there's a much broader moral issue around the ethics of citizen-funded, that is public-funded research, where public-funded research should be available to the public to see and to verify. So there are these different aspects to data sharing, the selfish ones around increasing citation impact, but also allowing other people to verify what you're doing, but also taking it forward and doing other things with it. And I've highlighted these because I think actually these different reasons and thinking about them can be consequential. And in particular, as we'll come to see, if we only focus on the first or the second, the kind of blue shaded area, if we only think data sharing is about reproducibility, then that might actually affect what we share. Because if we only share the data that is necessary in order to reproduce the p-values, reproduce the f-values or whatever statistics are in a paper, then of course that is all that other people will be able to do with it. And some of these other things, like reconceptualizing data or recompiling it, may become difficult if we don't share all of the raw data. So I think we need to think about these different purposes of data sharing because they might affect what gets shared and how it gets shared and how useful it might be to other people. So from this position, we've come to the idea in many cases that people have established that there's a bit of a data.
Sorry, John, I'm just going to pause you a sec. There's a hand raised from Melanie.
Yeah, go for it.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm half hidden. I'm a postdoc here in the psychology department, but my background is in qualitative research methods. So I'm not very familiar with quantitative, but in qualitative, you would, if you were to make data available, which of course is being done, how would you deal with the context? Like, would you also have if you wanted to perform a secondary data analysis, for example, with quantitative data, would you also have the issue that you don't necessarily know what context they were generated in or how they were interpreted?
Yeah. So let me say that I'm focusing here on a quantitative perspective, but I'm very aware that there are obviously both opportunities and issues around the sharing of qualitative data. Let me come back to that because I think I can address this a little bit later in the talk. But if I don't, then do ask me again. But I think one of the later slides will come closer to this, and I'll try explicitly to make the point about that context and circumstances around the potential sharing of qualitative data. It's important, so thank you. Is that okay?
Sure, thank you very much.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the idea of the data sharing problem is that we haven't progressed necessarily a lot beyond Galton's ideas that it would be a good idea, that there isn't enough data sharing. We've got a fairly low prevalence of it. Now, we can see some evidence of that from various sources. Here's a figure from Tom Hardwick and colleagues who looked at the amount of data sharing that was going on across the social sciences, so psychology, but also economics, and so sociology and a number of other disciplines. And they looked at different aspects of open science. I've highlighted here data availability. And of the 156 papers that they looked at, there were only 11, it's the right-hand edge of that graph. There were only 11 where there was data sharing. All the others had some either limited or no data sharing associated with the papers. This was based on work in published between 2014 and 2017. In a paper that I published last year with David Ellis and Andrea Towse, and I'm going to talk about this work more later, we looked at 15 journals in psychology. We ploughed through 2,243 papers from those journals, of which 1,900 were eligible papers. So obviously, you exclude the editorials, the errata, the theoretical commentaries, and so on, where there would be no data to share. And of those 1,900 papers, 71 had open data. So that's just under 4% of papers. Again, this is between 2014 and 2017. Some journals here you can see are doing much better than others, but overall the situation looks like there's not a lot of data sharing. And in a recent preprint earlier this year, Huff and Bongartz looked at the landscape in educational psychology in 2018 and 2020. Research data availability was generally low here at 4%. So very similar to the data I've just described. And in fact, in their preprint, they've got a number of journals that they've sampled from, and you can see that the data availability is minuscule. Okay, so this is something of a problem. Given all the advantages from data sharing, surely we should be seeing more of it. Well, that definitely is a problem, and we need to sort of advocate for more data sharing and find ways to encourage this to happen. But whilst most of the debate has focused on this being the problem, what I want to do next is say that this isn't necessarily all the crux of all the problem. In other words, it's not just the presence of research data, but the form. That is, not just whether there is a data deposit, but whether that data deposit is usable or functional. As the questioner said just a few minutes ago, if data sharing does happen, is it going to be useful to others without with the appropriate context that would be necessary to properly make sense of it? Well, we actually have some evidence of this from the work of Dominique Roche and others from 2015. Now, what this team did in a paper in PLOS Biology was look at ecology and evolution, that's the areas that they worked in, to investigate what data sets looked like associated with publications in the field. So what they did was they took 100 data sets from a repository called Dryad, where they knew that they were coming from journal papers where the journal had a strong data policy. So basically mandating that data were available. And what they did was they focused on two dimensions of the deposit. First of all, was the data set complete? So is all the data there that you would need to replicate, so that is rather reproduce what was in the journal paper? So could you, in principle, find the data to re-establish all of the results that were claimed in the paper? Second, how readily could the data be accessed and reused by third parties? For example, were the data made available in a proprietary software format that you might have available to you, but might not be available in a couple of years' time, or 10 years' time, or 30 or 40 years' time? Is it locked into a particular format? So they focused on these two dimensions of data sets that were available, and they essentially developed an ordinal scoring system for the quality of data. And it went from high quality data, everything seemed fine, things were exemplary in terms of what was complete and reusable, through to much lower scores where they identified more significant problems. And so what this points to is things like the long-term prospects for data use and data interpretation. And what Roche et al. Found is a lot of variation in these data sets. Moreover, they also found that in the majority of them, in 56%, the data sets were incomplete because of either missing data or insufficient metadata. So metadata are the things that allow you to understand what the columns of the quantitative data involve, as well as its provenance and so on. And this also relates to that earlier question about qualitative data, where the context coded in metadata are going to be particularly important. Though there will be other things as well, and I'll come on to that. But although metadata can be seen in a particular way with quantitative data, I think you'd understand that there'll be aspects of qualitative data that would be potentially issues there. Even larger majority of studies, 64%, were archived in a way that either partially or fully prevented reuse, either because they lacked metadata or because the data presented in processed rather than raw form, so it was means rather than the actual raw data, or because inadequate file formats were used. So in a more extreme case, for example, a data deposit as a PDF image of the data, which of course makes it far from straightforward to incorporate the data. And yes, you might be able to use optical character recognition to convert that image into text and then import the text and then check it. But it's creating a big obstacle, and a lot of people will just bail out at that point rather than going through all of the labor in order to access the data. And this led Mons and others to say that unfortunately most open data is actually reuseless rather than reusable. So it's this aspect of data quality that I want to focus on next and present some data. So I've already said that we looked at the landscape of data prevalence, but we also wanted to look at the functionality and characteristics of data. So we were trying to replicate what Roche et al. Had done, but for psychology, because we're psychologists, but also because we wanted to know whether, is there something about what the community in ecology and evolution are doing, or psychology, that might make the profile different. Their data came from 2012, 2013, and we wanted a longer time and more recent time window to see whether things had changed. And also by redoing the work based on their analysis, we wanted to augment some of the variables they had and clarify a couple of issues. So we pre-registered our study. We had 2 linked forms because as soon as we started looking at journals, we very rapidly discovered that our original plan to look at 2012, 2013, that's Roche's time point, was just not going to be feasible at all, because there was just essentially no available data. So we had a second pre-registered form where we had to adapt our sampling procedure to account for the fact that the data were absent at a particular time period. I don't want to spend too much here, but we tried to sample across psychology. So we looked at some different subfields. We made sure we looked at work from different publishers. There were both society-owned and independent journals. Some were OA journals, open access journals. Some were hybrid. So we were trying to sample the space, not in a systematic way, but trying to look at different sorts of variables that obviously go into publication. We didn't choose cognition. Tom Hardwick had analysed cognition a few years ago, so we sort of avoided the duplication in that. We didn't look at mega journals, PLOS, Frontiers and so on, because they were so big it was going to be difficult to do appropriate sampling. So what we did was we looked at data sets and we tried to assess their quality. Now here's one aspect of quality that we looked at that I think is worth commenting on, and that is where the data archive was. So here are some of the URLs for the data set, and you can see here there are some at Open Science framework with a full DOI. But in the middle, there's a link to a personal website. I've redacted that website for now. Now, there are two issues. One, a personal website can change. It can go down. It can get taken off. So it's not as stable as you would like. But also, if you look at the file structure here, even after going to that top level domain of the website, there's a folder for resources and a subfolder for supplementary material and a subfolder for other resources and so on to eventually get to the record. Now, one of the issues with that type of structure is inadvertently or otherwise, it only takes for one of these subfolders to get moved, deleted or renamed, and that link is going to become problematic. It might not work. And depending on the nature of it, it might be more or less difficult to then recover where the original data are. So Roche et al. Were using data deposited in Dryad in a particular repository. So they didn't sample across different repositories as we'd done, because we started with the journals rather than the repository. But you can see here that there are potential issues with where these things locate. Also here in brackets, we've got same as paper. So here there are available data, but they're supplementary data on the journal website. So they're not in an independent repository, but held by the journal. And one of the problems with that is that sometimes these supplementary materials just disappear. And I think, in fact, Louise is on this meeting, and Louise has examples of her work being published at various points where data were available as supplementary material in the journal, and the journal publishers just decided to flick a switch and that data had gone. So one of the issues with using the journal's own systems is that there aren't those longevity plans that you would want. So we looked at where things were. We also looked at Roche's scales for whether the data were complete and whether the data were reusable. I don't expect you to be reading these tables, but just that we had this information to work from to try and get the same type of scoring and system that Roche et al. Had done. So we're not actually attempting to reproduce the analysis in the paper. It's prima facie reproducibility. Does it look on the face as though you would be able to get at the results in the paper, given what's in the paper, given what's in the data set? Or would there be some noticeable problem? We also trained on a very small subset of the data that Roche et al. Had used. So they de-anonymized a handful of their data sets to allow us to do our scoring and check that our scoring corresponded to theirs. So again, we had at least some initial measure of what we were doing compared to theirs. Okay, so I showed you in text form that Roche et al. found problems with the majority of data sets in terms of completeness and reusability. This is the profile of scores for the data sets from Roche et al. The dotted red line between a score of 3 and 4 essentially separates what would be acceptable according to most journal policies. On the right, the score of 4 and 5, and data sets that are problematic in some respects, the 1, 2, or 3. So that's what they found. When we did the same thing with the psychology data, we found, in fact, a pretty similar profile of performance. That there is a wide distribution of scores for data quality, both for completeness and for reusability. Indeed, if we look at what Roche et al. Said, about 56% of data sets were incomplete. For psychology, using the corpus we found 51% of data sets were incomplete. They found that 64% of studies had reusability problems. We found 68% of our studies had reusability problems. In cases where there was only a small amount of data problems around completeness, Roche et al. Found that 40% of the data sets were kind of only slightly incomplete. whereas we found that only slightly incomplete figure was much lower. So broadly, we've got a very large degree of similarity, but there are also some differences in how severe some of these problems are for psychology compared to ecology and evolution. Now, as I've said, our time window was a little bit different from that used by Roche and others, but it points to the way this problem is continuing. We found that completeness and reusability was improving over time. So comparing 2014-2015 to 2016-2017. However, if you see the effect sizes here for the improvement over time, the eta squareds are really pretty low, 0.04 and 0.03. That's really poor news if in terms of estimating how long it's going to take for completeness and reusability to be high. It's going to take far too long given the kind of effect sizes that we've got here. We broadly found that impact ranking didn't really predict either completeness and reusability, so marquee journals aren't doing a better job of this than non-marquee journals. And also, I just wanted to point out here at the bottom that when we talk about complete data, we're really just looking at whether you could reproduce the results from the paper. We're not even looking at whether you can do other things, whether you would be able to get at all of a scale so that you could recompute it, reanalyze it, or do other things with it. So we're looking at a pretty low bar for what the data are showing. One of the things that we found in psychology was there was a bit of a paradox in that sometimes we actually got too much data. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that as many psychologists here, I think, in the audience will know that in psychology, sometimes you need to exclude some data or exclude some participants. You might have a fussy baby for whom the data are going to be too noisy. You might have baseline performance that isn't above chance. You know that your participant isn't doing any better than chance, and they need to be in order to have their data included in analysis. There might be catch questions on Amazon Mechanical Turk or some other platform, and if the workers don't pass the attention catch questions, you assume they're watching telly or Netflix whilst they're doing your experiment, and traditionally you would exclude them. A whole variety of reasons why, legitimate reasons why, in psychology at least, we might exclude some participants from analysis. And all of that is a good thing. We want high quality data. However, it should be clear that we need to know when data have been excluded, who are the excluded data, and who or where is the non-excluded data used for the reports. Okay, so this data exclusions don't need to be a problem, but they do need to be coded. And what we found when we looked at our data sets was in a number of cases, we couldn't establish where the data exclusions were. So we had more participants than were in the paper, but we had no way of knowing which of the participants were excluded. Now, of course, you could potentially computationally go through every combination of data exclusions to try work this out, but this is really not a feasible option for most people. Instead, it just makes the data functionally meaningless, and it would take very little to add a column, add some indication of which were excluded participants to allow you to look at this. Plus, of course, looking at those excluded participants to see whether that made a difference. So this data is potentially really useful, but it's just being presented to people in ways that actually provide hurdles rather than opportunities. So we had at least 5 of 60 cases with sort of ambiguous excess data, paradox data sets. We weren't really looking for these errors. If we'd done it systematically, we might have found more instances here. And as I said, we didn't look for solutions, but it suggests that what we're seeing is cases where the data haven't been prepared for archiving as well as one might think they could be or should be. Okay, now again, I said I wanted to make the argument that I don't think this is specific to psychology, just as I don't think it's specific to ecology and evolution. You know, we've got very similar profile. So there was also a conference paper in 2020 at the Computer-Human Interaction Conference that also looked at transparency in computer science. This was based on a self-report survey rather than an analysis of data sets. But notice in that paper that they also found, so this is a direct quote from the conference paper, 6 DOIs where the authors responded that they shared the artifacts, but in fact, the authors were unable to retrieve them. So there wasn't any response to a request, there was a broken link, or respondents only provided data as an image. What I'm saying here is we seem to have the same phenomena that I've already described in our psychological data sets. They also found that GitHub outranked science-oriented repositories like OSF as the place where research artifacts were placed. So 36 to 57% of the respondents only shared on GitHub. And there are ways of dealing with long-term repository and creation of DOIs, but they weren't being utilized by the community that were publishing. Moreover, they also said that in four cases that the data weren't shared because they said that according to the information, they were sensitive to participants' privacy. The authors, however, noted that on inspection, they found no reason for participants' personal data to be in the data set. In other words, they could have been removed. They could have used various ways to make the data anonymous and effective that weren't implemented. Now, as I said, this is a different way of looking at the landscape. This is a self-report study, but I think what's clear, given what we already know from ecology and evolution and from psychology, is that there's at least a strong expectation that we're going to find some similar types of problems in many different domains. So I don't have an awful lot more that I'm going to say, but I just want to have a little interim summary to focus on what we've covered so far. Where are we now, but where do we want to go? So this is the landscape, as I said, for psychology, where the majority of data sets have issues with completeness and reusability. But remember, I said that there's very low prevalence of data sharing. In fact, if we code sort of where data sharing doesn't happen, you know, with that 96% of papers that don't share anything, you can see that essentially swamps or overwhelms the profile of quality for those that do. So imagine this is a deck of cards all on the left-hand side. You know, if we were able to take those papers which aren't sharing data and convert those into high quality shared data and the right-hand column 5, then these problems that I've discovered would be like pimples on the surface. Okay, they would swamp things. At the same time, if we take these non-shared papers and for one reason or another the authors don't share things with high quality, then, you know, again, even the exemplary data sets are going to be in a really small majority. So we need to think not only about the profile, and that's what I focused on before, but also what are we going to do with all the papers where data aren't shared? And if we address the first part of the data sharing problem, how do we make sure that what starts to happen is things fall onto that right-hand side, the high quality side of things? So in the paper from last year, we came up with a number of recommendations, and some of these I don't need to spend long on because I've really kind of referred to them already. We really want to encourage journals and authors to use third-party repositories, repositories like Dyad, like OSF, Zenodo, and others, which have persistent URLs and longevity. We want to avoid, where possible, the use of supplementary data on journal websites as the place where data gets shared. We also think increasingly researchers and funders should be thinking about planning and budgeting for efficient data creation. So it doesn't need to take terribly long to create a high quality data set. But of course, if you're at the end of your grant, you've got a requirement to submit things, everything needs to go in by the end of today, then of course those are the situations in which inadvertently things may not be set up as effectively as possible. So if we want higher quality data, we need to budget for it, and so do, of course, the funders of our work. It would also help, we think, to have common standards for data availability statements. So one of the things that I didn't make explicit in our work earlier was that when we were looking for where data was, there wasn't much of it, as I said. In some cases, we found it in a footnote. In some cases, it would be a footnote that would only be available if you hovered your mouse over the highlighted area of a HTML page that wouldn't be available otherwise. I think just the ways that we think about telling people where our data are could do with some common standards and some ease of availability. And I think there are various things that both authors and journals can do to play a role in quality control that would avoid some of the issues that clearly seem to be there with broken links and lack of availability. But Dominic Roche and others pointed out back in 2015 that we haven't really been trained in doing this data sharing kind of thing. So in their domain, ecologists and evolutionary biologists receive little or no training in data management and may be unfamiliar with best practices. And when they looked at this since, Dominic Roche has found that one of the things that comes through from asking researchers is a call for standards and a call for training. So rather than just focusing on the problems with the data sharing that I've been looking at in the previous slides, I want to make sure we think more optimistically and more positively about what data sharing we want and how we develop it. So in the final few minutes of the talk, I want to address the training issue around the data problem. And one of the things that I want to say in doing that is increasingly I've come to believe, along with colleagues, that the data problem isn't just about academic research. It's not just about getting data archives for journal papers. But this is really a transferable skill in a whole variety of settings, governments, as well as commercial settings. Data sharing, data use is a big issue. And all the things that I've been looking at from an academic or research point of view will also be important when it comes to work outside of the ivory tower or academic setting. So not only do we want to address the data problem for science, I think we also want to address the data problem for society more generally, that people are comfortable with and familiar with ways of sharing and managing data. And that gives us, I believe, all the more motivation, all the more reason to think about how we train students, early career researchers, to engage with data management and data stewardship. And if you want to encourage better practices, I think you need to start early as possible, and engage the individuals that you want to do this data management. I think it's going to be much easier to develop good habits than try and break existing ones. And so for all our undergraduate students in psychology, for example, who are doing research projects, when they're not sharing their data, when the master's students are doing their research projects and they're not sharing their data, what essentially we're doing is building up an expectation of practice in which data sharing doesn't happen. We then need to break those habits to encourage the things that we actually want. So increasingly we've begun to think, well, maybe we should just be bringing this into the landscape of what students do as early as possible. do it in a safe way, do it in a scaffolded and a structured way, but so that students come to think about this as just what they do, and also then learn about how to do it from their own experience and others, so that gradually the quality is going to improve just by the inculcation of those good practices. And as the nudge team would tell us, if we want to change behavior, and if we want to encourage data sharing, the sorts of things that we should focus on. So the nudge team would focus on the EAST principles, which is you want to make the behavior that you're looking to encourage easy, attractive, social, that is also done by others, and timely. So we can make it easy again by developing practices over time. We can make it attractive by focusing on the benefits and the incentives for doing it. We can make it social by showing that everybody else is doing it, and timely, thinking about when in the research or data production life cycle, thinking about data management can be important. So I want to just say a little bit about a system that we've got in psychology at Lancaster, where we've been working to develop data management amongst master's students in the empirical work that they do. So I think, Dermot, you're going to be able to post this URL into the chat, because I don't have access to the URL right now. Thanks, Dermot, to the website, and we can play a game of Can We Break the Server? So if you get that URL, hopefully you can click on the link, you can open a browser that's going to take you to this website, where we have a repository of student records. Now, what we have in that repository are the titles and some basic descriptions of master's projects that have been done in psychology at Lancaster. They also include, for example, they also include a consent form that was used for that project. That's deliberate. It's part of metadata or context for what participants did. But having consent forms also means that instead of asking students to reinvent the wheel every time they do a project, creating a consent form or creating a consent form using a sort of 30-year-old research methods textbook that they find in the library, we can actually provide them with contemporary and relevant consent forms from work that they do. But also, in at least some cases, we also provide the data from the projects. So if you go to the search box that's here in the top right of the page, and if you put in the name, let's see if I can do this for you. Dermot, can you see my web page right now?
Yes, I can see that.
Perfect. So I'm going to put your surname in here. Let's see if we can break the the server doing this. If I put in your surname into the database, there are 3 student projects that are on that system, and then I can click on any one of these to bring up that record and find more information about it, at least if the system is going to work for me as I talk. Now, from a student point of view, that also means when they're going to be supervised by Dermot in doing a project, they also now have a record of the sorts of projects that Dermot has supervised in the past. And that's also the sort of thing that can potentially help shape their understanding of, you know, what the opportunities might be around a master's project that would be appropriate. Now, in some cases, it looks like these links aren't working for me right here, right now. In some cases, the information is just the methods and the results and information around sampling that allows you to understand what the data set involved. And if you wanted that data set, the procedure here is that you would contact the Luster website with the reference information to get the data. So here we've actually got the data. We've got a code book that provides the metadata to explain what this quantitative data involves. If it was qualitative data, then again, context can be provided as appropriate to both help and also provide delimiters around the use of the data. So if the data's been shared, you can access it. If the data here hasn't been shared, then you contact the website, and then we would look at the request for data and make it available. Now, one of the reasons we don't make all records available with the data set is that we don't have necessarily the bandwidth to check on the legal or other implications or ramifications of sharing the data. So you know, we don't know whether any anonymity is being breached or so on. So rather than have to work through and check all of the data, it seems better instead, even though it would be nice to share all of the data, but it would be it's better to create this sandpit, this safe space for students to see a system and contribute to it. That process of thinking about the requirement to share their data and going through the process of submitting their data to a central email box that can later be moved to the system, at least allows students to engage with the process. Okay, so that was a very brief demonstration. Now there are some other links that I can show you where we provide some guides on how to use the system, how to upload new records for students. And we ask students to take a previous cohort of data and upload them for themselves so they get some experience of working with this as part of the system. Let me just wrap up here, though, with this one slide and then a conclusion. So in terms of embedding data management in the curriculum, the idea of this Lustre system is really just that we promote data management, we promote data sharing by making it part of the student experience. Students are taught in a formal session about this system, about their requirements to submit data as part of their dissertation, and they're encouraged to explore data on the system. I can, outside of the talk, I can provide links to the taught sessions, so the PowerPoint lectures and slides and other materials. But it's partly the catalogue of student projects and partly the experience and partly the expectation that we are asking students to submit data that altogether we hope goes towards that encouragement and that training of making data sharing more a normal activity for students to do. Okay, so I think I've come pretty much to the hour. So let me just put this final slide up for conclusions from what I've been going through. I think it's going to be clear that one of the things that I'm saying is we need to still work towards greater availability of public data, to more data sharing, even in cases where we know there are some journals that are doing a lot more of it. If we look at the landscape overall, it's clear that the prevalence of data sharing isn't anything like what we really need it to be as a scientific community. But also, I hope I've convinced you that data sharing on its own isn't necessarily enough. What you really want is high quality data sharing, because otherwise data sharing might be done in such a way as, whilst there is a deposit or an archive there, it's functionally not usable, and it may as well not be there. Also, we want to think about what gets shared, and increasingly think about the more maximalist, the more useful ways of sharing as much high quality data as possible, so that it can be used not just for the paper itself, but for the broader scientific enterprise. I think we have to recognize the obstacles to data sharing, the obstacles from researchers, the obstacles that might be put in place by concerns about how data are going to be used and so on, but then find ways to overcome those obstacles, to support the incentives, both structural incentives and also personal incentives that make data sharing, or should make data sharing, a more positive experience for everybody. And finally, as part of that, I want to encourage people to think about how we train and guide people to do data sharing, not just expect that it happens, and not just expect that it's all going to happen at this end point of scientific publication, but as part of a broader process of educating, guiding, and training people to thinking about data management. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Great. I'm going to stop recording now, and then